gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm here to bring you a tutorial for Rising Waters. This is a digital rulebook, so there will be timestamps in the show notes that will let you jump to the parts of the video that you most want to see. We're going to go ahead and start with setup, then we're going to work through turn structure, some of the special or optional aspects of the game, and then finally water rules, which are probably the most complex aspect of Rising Waters. So we're going to go ahead and start with 1926 setup. So there are two scenarios for this game. There is fall 1926 and there's spring at 1927. Fall 1926 is the more introductory scenario, so that's one that we're going to start with. Then we're going to move on to 1927, so use the timestamps if that's the one that you would rather see. We are currently on the 1927 side of the board, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and flip it over. And voila, 1926. So one of the things to notice about both sides of the board is that you've got a bunch of different groups of hexes on here. They are in fact called hex groups, and then several different significant locations that you're going to be using to determine where you're moving and also where water is going to flood the area. So there are some key locations here. We have Mound's Landing, Yazoo Valley, Cabin Teal, Tinsaw Basin, and Vicksburg, which is a city that you are not allowed to build too close to, but it is nice that it's here. You're also going to see that the board is divided into little hex groups with numbers in them. So the number is the elevation of the entire hex group. And also in the 1926 version of the game, most things are done by hex group. So you move hex group to hex group, you build levees, and the levee will impact the level of the entire hex group. And then when you flood, and this is true in both versions of the game, then you flood the entire hex group. In 1927, movement works differently and levees work differently because those are based on individual hexes instead of the hex group. So make sure that you're paying attention to these outlines as well as to individual hexes as you play. So here's our board. We've got plenty of cards, which I'm going to teach you how to set up in just a moment. We've also got a whole bunch of tokens. So these blue hex tokens are going to go on the board when we are adding water during a flood. This container has relief camp tokens, which you will not use in the 1926 version of the game. So they're here just because I've sorted them here, but you do not use these in 1926. And we're going to talk about them in a special section at the end of my explanation of 1927 scenario. And this is a raft. Rafts are going to be used to help survivors, which we'll talk about in more detail when we get to movement and how to build one of these. We've also got these water tokens, which are going to help us determine the level of the water, which will change. We've also got levee tokens, which will help us determine the elevation of the land as we build levees. Additionally, we've got all of the pawns that are not player colors in this little cup. The cup doesn't come with the game, by the way. It's just a Ziploc container I got from the grocery store. But nonetheless, gather all of your pawns of other colors, aside from the ones that you're playing with. So I've got yellow and blue over here because those are my player colors. And those are basically the components. You're also going to have some round trackers to place. On 1926, you're going to place two of them. You're going to place one counter at the 0 space on the weeks tracker because you're supposed to survive for a certain number of weeks. And then you're also going to place a token on the losses tracker because you're going to be tracking how many losses you take. So before we get any further into setup, this is maybe a good time to talk about victory conditions. You and your fellow players are going to be working cooperatively to survive a catastrophic flooding event that historically did happen and that was an absolute disaster for the sharecroppers who lived in this area. The victory conditions for 1927 are different, but in the 1926 version of the game, your water elevation starts at 1. You're going to start at 0 weeks. You're trying to make it through 7 weeks. And the limit on losses you can take depends on the number of players in the game. So in the fall 1926 version of the game, across 7 rounds, your maximum losses are 22 for 2 players, 18 for 3 players, and 14 for 4 players. So things get a little tougher the more of you there are because there's more people to work on the problem. It really never gets any easier though. So as you set up for the 1926 game, keep in mind how many rounds you've got to survive and how many losses you're able to take and still win the game. You're also going to give each player one player board that comes with 1 town, 4 pawns, and 11 cubes. And we're going to talk about how to set a lot of this up a bit later. You're going to take 1 purple pawn. So that's this pawn. This is a survivor pawn, and they're going to go within 1 land space of the dot at Mound's Landing. So if you look up here on the map, you can see a dot right here. You have a 4 and a 2. So we're definitely putting our survivor here on the 4 because that just gives them a better chance of, surviving. And now I'm going to show you how to set up some card decks. The first thing we're going to take care of is weather reports. These are the cards that are going to tell us how much flooding happens and where it happens. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to remove all of the cards from the deck that are heavy rain cards. So it'll say heavy rain and it'll have 3 raindrops on it. You'll have different locations, but the point here is to just remove all the cards that say heavy rain. You're going to shuffle them up You're going to keep 9 of them. And then the rest of these are going to return to the box. So for the 1926 scenario, you have fewer of these nasty heavy rain cards that go into the deck. So these will go into the box. And the 9 that you kept, you're going to shuffle into the weather reports deck. So shuffle these in here really good. And then when you're done, place them right here in the weather reports space on the board. Next, we're going to take care of the landowner deck. So here I've divided the landowner deck according to its contents because not all of the landowner cards are going to go into the deck when you're playing the fall 1926 scenario. In fact, you should go ahead and remove all of the landowner fleas cards, dynamite cards, and relief camp cards because you're not going to be playing with any of these in this scenario. Next, you're going to limit how many of these other threatening cards go into the deck, but we have to talk about something first. You notice these cards over here that are fanned out and they have a star up here in the right-hand corner. These are the cards that are going to be shuffled and placed on top of the deck. And this deck does contain 2 threat and 1 race hatred card. So keep that in mind when you're making your deck. So with that, we're going to take 5 force cards. The rest are going to go away. We're going to take 5 race hatred cards, but we have 1 in the starred deck. So we're only going to take 4 of the ones with no star in the top corner. The rest can leave the game. And then you're going to keep 10 threat cards, but since there's already 2 with stars on them, you're only keeping 8 without. So you keep 8. And then the remainder can leave the game. Then to create your landowner deck, you're going to take all of the cards with no stars in the top right-hand corner, and you're going to shuffle them and put them here in the space marked landowner deck. Then you're going to take all the landowner cards that have stars on them. You're going to shuffle those, and you're going to put those cards on top of the landowner deck. At this point, you're going to reveal the top 3 landowner cards. There might be some that you have to resolve, but you don't have to do it yet. You can handle landowner card resolution at the moment that you hit that part of your first turn, and I will show you when and where. But for now, let's reveal 1, 2, 3. So we got lucky that time. It's a bunch of job offers. We're going to learn how to handle all of that very shortly. Next, we're going to take all of the community cards and shuffle those. These are your cards in the game, and this is where all of your magic is going to happen. So we're going to give them a good shuffle. And technically, you should be placing them here at the community deck. But the reason that we're not doing that is because I want to have better access to the player boards for the purposes of this tutorial. So I'm going to be putting the community deck up here. This is also the time to draw your first cards from the community deck. So you're going to deal 7 cards from that deck to each player. So now that our player boards have 7 cards each, let's talk about how to get these boards set up, and then we're going to talk about the initial placement of player pieces out here. So here are our player boards, and we've got 7 community cards each, 4 pawns, 11 cubes, and 1 town. We're not going to use all of it right away, but I am going to show you how to get it set up. So for now, let's go ahead and move the community cards off to the side so we can get all of this nice real estate in view. And what's going to happen first is we're going to place our cubes out on these player boards. So if you have a look at the left-hand side of these boards, you're going to see renewable powers, and on the right-hand side, you're going to see permanent powers. And whether you have access to these or not is marked by cube placement on your player board. So here we're going to put the cubes in the starting positions of each board. So now our cubes are more or less entirely set up for a basic game without any individual player powers. So these cubes essentially mark which powers you currently have access to. On the left-hand side, you have renewable powers, and these are powers that you use your community cards to pay for, but they're one time. So you pay the cards for them, you show the power is active, and at the time that you use the power, you move the cube, and then if you want the power back, you have to spend the cards all over again. So there are some suits in the game. So here we have farm animals, family, gardening, garden, church, blues, and the hammer is a build action that comes off of the job offer cards. So all of your cards are going to have a symbol, and basically you're spending cards with these symbols to get the powers. So those are your renewable powers. You pay to be able to do them one time. You've also got permanent powers where you're paying cards from the same suit to be able to upgrade your stuff permanently. So everybody has a base of 2 actions per turn. If you spend 2 garden cards, then you can move up to 3. And then once you've done that, you can spend an additional 3 garden cards to move up to 4. Pawns are a little bit different. You have access to 4 pawns in the game once you have fully upgraded this power, but at setup, we're about to place 3. So there's a bit of an erratum here in the graphic design. What you should do is put your cube on 3 because you're going to start with 3 pawns. If you lose a pawn and you go down to 2, then you'll pay 2 cards to bump back up to 3. And if you pay 3 family cards, then you can bump up all the way to 4, which is your max number of pawns. So this is just going to track how many pawns you currently have access to, which at the start of the game is 3. If you're spending your church suit of cards, they're going to increase the number of cards you're able to donate on a given turn, which you definitely want for a number of reasons, which we'll get to. And then you can also use blues cards to turn on the power to swim. And if you want to cross the water in this game, you absolutely need that ability. You need it to build a raft. You definitely need to learn how to swim. It's a flood. So that is the basics of these renewable and permanent powers. And then if you want to set up for individual powers, then you are going to also place your cube down here in this empty spot. And you're also going to move, see how there's a red outline space on each of these boards? You're going to move the cube here and start that way at the beginning of the game. So basically, if you're going to play for individual victory points, you also start with some asymmetrical advantages from the start of the game. And we will talk a bit more about individual victory points a bit later. I do want to note that on one of the player boards, you are told to start your pawn here on 3, but everybody's pawn starts there. So if you've got this board and this asymmetric power, go ahead and start with 4 pawns instead. And those are the player boards. Let's finish off setup. All right, so let's go ahead and get those initial towns and pawns out. So each of us is going to place our player town on a hex of our choice on the main board. The rules for town placement are that you have to place your towns within 3 hexes of a water source, so you cannot get too far away from the river, sadly. And they also all need to be at least 5 hexes apart. You are also not allowed to place your town within 5 hexes of Vicksburg. No. So let's say that I want to put my blue town here. So I'm 2 hexes away from the water, and I'm in an elevation 3 area, which seems pretty good to me. I'm a little close over here to this lake, but we're just going to have to deal with it. Then I've got my yellow player. Let's say that they want to go here, where they are, again, within 3 hexes of the water, and they're on a nice elevation 3 space, which just seems pretty safe. And then we do have to place 1 more town. So let's go ahead and put them here on this 4 spot that's within 3 spaces of this water source. So those are our towns. We've placed them out here. We've stayed well away from Vicksburg. Next, we're going to place our pawns. So this town won't have any pawns because there's no actual player of this color who built that town. It's just a 2-player setup thing. But blue town is going to get 2 of its pawns in the same hex as the town. And that's also true for yellow. And then we're going to place a 3rd pawn. And that 3rd pawn is going to go basically anywhere we want, as long as it's within 2 hexes of one of the dots here on the main board. So let's say that we're going to put the blue pawn here. So we're 2 spaces away from the water, and we're also fairly close to the yellow town. And now yellow would like to do something a bit similar. So let's maybe look at Tensaw Basin. We'll go 1, 2, and we'll put the yellow pawn there for starters. So now we are in range to help each other. So now that the pawns are all out, it's time to place levees. And again, in the 1926 version of this game, the levee height applies to the entire hex group, which means that we can shore up some of these little 2s, and that seems like a really good idea to me. So as long as it's bordering water, you can build a levee to build the land up. So let's say that yellow is going to go first. Maybe they want to make this hex group of 3, this hex group of 3, and you can just place it over the number in this case since it applies to the entire group. It is by individual hex in 1927, so watch out for that one if you switch modes. And let's say that yellow is also going to shore up this too. Meanwhile, it's the blue player's turn. I think they would like to shore up this one. You could put them anywhere on the map. I'm just kind of keeping it close to home. You could do this one. And then maybe we would like to shore up this group right here. And we'll change that 2 to a 3. So now that our levees are all out, setup is almost done. We're just going to draw and resolve 3 weather report cards. We're not actually going to resolve them here. If you want to watch how that works, we are going to go to water rules at the end of the video. Go check the timestamps because the water rules are the most complicated part of this game. I'm going to do them all together in one big chunk at the end. But for now, we would draw and resolve 3 of these weather report cards. And that's setup. We're ready to begin play. But first, let's go ahead and take a look at the setup for 1927. All right, so now let's talk about the setup for the 1927 scenario of Rising Waters. We are now on the 1927 side of the board, which you could confirm both because it says 1927 on it and because there's a relief camp donations tracker at the bottom, which does not exist on the 1926 side. But then once again, you have all the same basic locations. We've got Mounds Landing, Yazoo Valley, Cabin Teal, Tinsaw Basin, Vicksburg, and then a whole bunch of different hex groupings with individual hexes inside. So your movements are going to involve individual hexes, but when you are flooding and determining where the water goes, you're flooding entire hex groups. And we are going to make sure that we specify throughout play. So we've got our board out, and we're also going to need all of our tokens out. We've got these blue water tokens that we're going to use when things flood. We've got raft tokens for when we want to rescue survivors. We have these dual-sided relief camp tokens that we will get to when I talk about special aspects of the game. We've got water level tokens to help us determine how high that water elevation is. We have levee tokens that are going to show us how high the land is where we've built levees. And of course, we've got all of the non-player color pawns. So I played with yellow and blue. Everything else went into this little cup. So first, we're going to go ahead and just place out our trackers. So we're going to go on the 0 of the weeks tracker. We're going to put one on the 0 of the losses tracker. And we're also going to put one on the 0 of the relief camp donations tracker. And I should note that just as in the 1926 version of this game, you're working cooperatively to try to survive a certain number of weeks without hitting a maximum number of losses. So in the 1927 version of the game, you are playing up to 10 rounds. And if you have 2 players, your max losses are 25. If you're playing with 3 players, the maximum is 22. And if you're playing with 4 players, the maximum is 19. And this is the harder version of the 2 games. Get your player mats ready. We're going to talk about these in more detail shortly. But you should know that you're going to have 11 cubes, 4 pawns, and a little town in each player color. I've also placed off to the side another town in a different player color, which I'm going to use later in setup because I'm showing you a 2-player game. We're going to place 1 purple pawn within 1 land space of the dot up at Mounds Landing. So you have a dot up here with a 4 and a 2. You know we're putting the survivor on the 4, higher elevation, higher survivability. And then we're going to handle our decks. So for the weather reports deck, you just take all the weather report cards, shuffle them up real good, and you're going to put them on the weather report space on the board. Your landowner deck consists of 2 parts. One is all the landowner cards that have a star in the top right corner. Keep those separate. Take all of the other landowner cards of all types and just shuffle them up into one big deck. So give them a good shuffle and place them in the landowner deck section by the board. Then you're going to take all of the starred landowner cards. So these are your starter ones. You're going to shuffle them up. And you're going to put these starred cards up on the top of the landowner's deck. Then you're going to reveal the top 3 of these cards. If there's something that you have to resolve, like a threat, then you don't do that now. You do it at the first phase of your player turn where you would handle those cards, and I'm going to get to it momentarily. But for now, we got lucky. We have 3 job offer cards, so that could have been much worse for a first landowner card spread. Then you're going to shuffle all of the community cards. So these are our cards. We're very happy about what's in here. It's all good stuff for us. So you shuffle them up. And you're going to deal 7 community cards to each player. So once you've made your community deck, in most versions of the game, you would put it here. But because I want better access to these player boards for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm putting the community deck up here. Now we're going to do some player setup stuff. You should know that the first player is determined randomly. So decide who that is now, because then we'll get to place things first on the board. But first, let's have a look at these lovely player boards. Let's go ahead and move our cards off to the side. And we will move our pieces off too so we can see the boards really well. So all that's left right now is the cubes, and that's because the cubes are going to show us our power setup. So you'll notice there's renewable powers and permanent powers on the left and right sides of this board. Let's go ahead and place our cubes. So our cubes are now placed in such a way that we can look at our powers a little more closely. There are several suits of card in this game. So you've got farm animals, you've got family, garden, church, and blues. And you can spend cards from those suits to get these one-time renewable powers. So, for example, if you spend a farm animal and a family card, then you can reduce the cost of your next levee build, which that's what the hammers are on these job offer cards. You can spend other cards to get better movement, a resist action, to upgrade a power, which is what's done over here, or to build a raft. So if you can swim and then you have a farm animal and a building symbol to spend, you could get a raft, which we'll talk about when we talk about movement. You've also got permanent powers, and this is where you're spending cards of the same suit to upgrade your powers that you can take per turn. So these don't degrade, and instead they just make you more and more powerful. So you have a base of 2 actions per turn, but if you spend garden cards, if you spend 2, then you can go up to 3, and then after that, if you spend another 3, you can go up to 4. No, you cannot skip directly from 2 to 4. You've got to work your way up by spending those cards. You can spend farm animals to get more movement per turn. You can spend family cards to upgrade your pawns. So everyone's going to start with 3 pawns at setup. It was originally 2, which is why the board looks like this, but it is now 3. There's going to be an erratum. But you should put your cube here on 3 pawns because that's how many we're going to place out on the board at the start of the game. Then you can spend cards to move your way up to 4 pawns, or if you go down to 2 pawns, you can spend to go back to 3 and then to 4 because you may actually lose pawns throughout the course of the game. You will donate cards for various reasons. You can originally only donate 1 card at a time, but if you spend church cards, you can increase your donation powers. And then you also are definitely going to want to invest in some blues cards to help you learn to swim, because that's how you're going to cross this water. It's how you're going to be able to build a raft. Trust me, you want to be able to swim. It is a flooding game after all. The only other thing you may notice is that there's an 11th cube and this little strip at the bottom. There are also 2 red spots on each of these boards. These are for when you are playing with optional individual player points. And so you can play a version of this game where you're working together, but also there are individual victory points and there's a bit of an asymmetric start. So for that, you would look at your special conditions for getting victory points. You're going to put your cube here to track it. And you're also going to move a cube that's up on the player board permanent powers area to reflect your personal asymmetric power. I do want to note that one board has a red ring around the 3 pawn spot. That is incorrect because everybody starts with 3 pawns. If you use this player, start with 4 pawns instead. So now that our player boards are set up, we're going to go ahead and place our first towns and pawns. Basically, each player is going to place a town that is within 3 spaces of water, that is not within 5 spaces of another town, and that is not within 5 spaces of Vicksburg. So you've got to get close to water and far from each other. So let's say that blue wants to go here. We have water on either side, but this is a nice little 3 elevation hex, so it's not too bad. And then let's say that yellow wants to go on the other side of the river, and that we're going to go here, which is at a 2 elevation, and which is not ideal, but we're doing our best, and we are close to the water. Maybe we want to try to levee this area up. Then we're going to place our pawns. So you can place 2 pawns right here in the same hex as your town. Yellow will do the same. Then you're going to place 1 pawn within 2 hexes of any of these little dots that's at a water source. So let's say that I actually want to have some cross river support. So maybe I'll put a blue pawn here near Cabin Teal. And then I'm going to place my yellow pawn maybe down. Here's my dot. So we'll go 1, 2. Right here near this Tensaw Basin. So we're going to try to be able to help each other on either side of the river. We also need to place 1 more town, and this is just an extra town that exists because in a 2-player game, you need it to balance everything out. Let's go ahead and put this town, let's see. Let's put it over here. Hopefully it's not going to get into too much trouble, but you never do know. Now that we've placed our pawns and our towns, we're going to place starting at levees. So each player is going to get to place a certain amount of levees depending on the player count. So in a 2-player game, we're each going to place 2 brown levee tokens per player. So 2 each. If you're playing with 3 or 4 players, then each player would only get to place 1 of these brown levee tokens. And note that these tokens are only going to apply to the hex they're on, not to the entire grouping. So let's say that I want to be extra safe with my yellow pawn. I'm going to bump this 3 to a 4. And then maybe I want to come here and make this 2 into a 3. So the problem here is that this 2 is still a 2, but this hex is now a 3 because it's got a levee. So I might want to build some more levees. Then the blue player is also going to place 2 levees, and they do need to be by water, so keep that in mind. Let's say we're going to put 1 right here to turn this 2 into a 3, kind of short things up a little bit. And then let's make this 2 a 3 as well, just to kind of protect everybody as much as we can. And then I might not want to hang out on this hex grouping for too long because this is a low elevation and that can be a little scary. The water level in 1927 is already a 2, whereas it's a 1 in 1926. So we do have to be extra careful. And then now that I've placed all of my stuff, we're going to do our weather reports. So that means I'm going to draw 3 weather report cards. I'm not going to resolve them right now because I'm going to show you how to do it in the water rules. So that's the part you should skip to if you want to see that. But we will draw and resolve 3 of these weather report cards, and I will show you how to do that later in the video. So that is the basics of setup. Now let's go ahead and talk through player actions and the structure of a turn. So now we're going to go through the Rising Waters turn structure. Turn structure in this game is listed conveniently on the player aid where we have the phases of the rounds, and we're going to go through these one by one in their entirety. So let's go ahead and start with number 1, upgrade player abilities. So this is the time to look at that hand of community cards that we drew earlier during setup. So in this hand, the blue player's hand, we have 1 blues card, 1 family card, 2 farm animals cards, 2 church cards, and outside activism. And these are cards that we're going to be able to spend to get those renewable and permanent powers that we talked about a little bit during setup. Let's have a closer look now. So if this is our current player board and these are our current cards, then I have some options in order to upgrade my powers. So for example, I can discard these 2 farm animal cards to go up to 4 movements per turn. And then if I wanted to upgrade again, I need to spend 3 different farm animals cards. You can't double dip. I would also, because I have 2 church cards, be able to spend these to increase my number of cards that I could donate per turn. And then I might want to hang on to these for some combos later. This outside activism card is useful both for its action and for dealing with landowner cards. And so we're going to talk about all of that as we go. And then these cards we are going to save because as the symbol indicates, as the text indicates, we're going to discard them to increase something. So the number of pawns in the case of a family card, or we will discard it for renewable powers. So we're going to hang on to these, and we would say that the blue player has upgraded some powers here. These cards that we spent would go to the discard. Similarly, our yellow player has a nice hand of cards. We have 2 garden cards. We have 2 resist action cards. We've got 1 education card, which is wild. It can be used as a wild community card. It cannot be used for a resistance card, but it can be used as anything else. And I love this picture of a teacher on the card. We've got 1 family card and 1 church card. So let's say I want to do something a little bit different. I could spend both of my garden cards to increase my actions per turn, which would be nice. But just to show off something different, let's say that I want to get a renewable power instead. I could spend 1 of my garden cards and my church card to activate my extra movement power. And let's say that I want to do a little bit extra. Maybe I want to use this wild as a farm animal. Normally I'd hold on to the wild for later, but this is a demo. I would also discard maybe a family card, and I could use that to turn on my cheaper building renewable power. And so these cards would go into discard. And this would be my remaining hand. So just to run through the powers very quickly, this one decreases the cost to build levees or to raise them. This one increases movement temporarily for 1 turn. This is a free resistance action, which we'll talk about. These cards, when spent, will let you upgrade 1 power over here on permanent powers. If you can swim, you have a farm animal and a build symbol, which basically is this job offer hammer symbol. You can build a raft, which we're going to talk about during movement. And then over here for your permanent powers, you can increase your actions per turn, your movement per turn, your pawns out on the board, the cards that you're able to donate, we're going to talk about donations momentarily, and your ability to swim. So all of these things are going to help you during the game. You should definitely be thinking about powering up as much as you can, as quickly as you can. Next, we're going to talk about replenishing and resolving landowner cards. So at the very beginning during setup, I set out these landowner cards, and these all happen to be job offer cards, which is a pretty low stress setup for landowner cards, but it's usually not that way. So right now we have all 3 job offers up. But there's a lot of nasty stuff in that deck, as you might have noticed, and sometimes it comes up. So you're either going to dig through the landowner deck in order to replenish these cards looking for job offers, or it's going to automatically happen during this replenish and resolve landowner cards phase during the turn. So let's say that instead of all those nice job offer cards, we'd instead pulled threat, race hatred, and a job offer card, which is the only one we actually want. When that happens, we actually have to resolve these immediately. Or if they're drawn during setup, you resolve them now during the first replenish and resolve phase of the turn. So here we have landowners issue a threat. This one says that the active player has to take it into their hands. So if this is drawn during the replenish phase, the first player is the active player. They are the ones who will take it into their hand. Or you can discard 1 resist action card to counter. Then you discard it. This card cannot be donated, so basically what it does is it clogs up your hand. If you want to get rid of it, You have to spin one of these cards that has a resist fist on it. So a resistance card is the only thing that can counter a threat. And what makes this card extra mean is that the resistance card has to happen from your own hand. Nobody can help you. So you either deal with it now or you get a resistance card later and take an action to get it out of your hand. Here we have race hatred. And this one is, of course, reflective of history, unfortunately. But this one says all players pay 2 community cards each, then discard the card. Actually, this outside activism card is fantastic because this one can be discarded also to eliminate a race hatred card, but it can only be used once per round. So if you draw more than 1 race hatred, you're kind of stuck. But if you draw 1 and you happen to have outside activism, then you're good to go. And in this case, anybody can have that card. It doesn't have to be the active player. So make sure that you check the rulebook for the specific descriptions of these landowner cards and check the text on the bottom because different people can contribute to handling different landowner cards. And then some of them actually you can't mitigate at all. So let's say that what actually happens is that the yellow player is first player and they play their outside activism card as a resistance symbol to get rid of the threat card. And then the other player, the blue player, is going to use outside activism to handle race hatred. In that case, all those cards are going to be discarded. And you're going to have to dig through the landowner deck again if you want to get some job offer cards because those don't just automatically come up. You have to choose to pull cards from that deck or go around to the next replenish and resolve phase of a turn. After that, we're going to move on to phase 3, and that is player actions. And the player actions, that's where you get to do stuff, are move, donate, work, and resist. So we're going to talk about all of these in order. So movement works differently depending on which version of the game you're playing. If you're playing the fall 1926 scenario, which is on the other side of the board, then your pawns are actually able to move by hex group. So these larger bold lines indicate where you can move. So if this were 1926, I could go 1, 2, 3, and I'd be moving hex groups. In 1927, however, you have to move by individual hexes. It is a much more challenging version of the game. So instead of being able to just cross the board through hex groups, I could only go 1, 2, 3. So that's a much tougher movement restriction. Make sure that you're paying attention to it because it does change depending on which version of the game you're playing. The only way to move across water is to get the swim ability, which is going to mean that you're going to have to discard some blues cards. Or if you're playing with individual player victory points, then you might already have that power depending on which color you're playing. And when you're moving, your pawns can move in any combination up to your movement limit. So, for example, here I had upgraded during my player power upgrade phase to get 4 movement per turn. I could move 2 spaces with one pawn and 2 spaces with the other. I could move one pawn 1 and the other 3, or I could move one pawn all 4 of my movement for that particular move action. You can split it up however you like. The other slightly tricky aspect of movement is moving with a raft. So if you build a raft during the upgrade player abilities phase of the round by having the swim ability, spinning a farm animal, and spinning a hammer symbol from a card in your hand, I'm going to show you how to get these shortly, then you're able to build a raft. So let's say that this blue pawn has built a raft, and then once they've built it, they're going to drag it whenever they move. So if I'm dragging the raft across land, let's say that I have my movement allotment of 4, I can go 1, 2 to move into the water. And then once I'm actually on the water, I can move double. So my move 3 could be 1, 2, and my move 4 could be 1, 2, and I could be going to get that survivor up there. So one thing to note is that you're able to save people up here. We're going to talk about it a little bit more when we talk through actions, but you as a separate action are able to pick up a survivor or to drop them off at a relief camp, which we're going to get to. So those are the basics of movement. If you want to, you can use both of your actions to move. Essentially, actions can be done on your turn in any combination. So one of your moves, if your blue is 4, if you're yellow, it's still 3. But you could move twice with both of your actions if that was what you wanted to do. Your next option is to donate, and there are a number of reasons why you might donate cards. So basically, as one action, you can donate a card to any other player up to the number of cards that you're allowed to donate based on your player powers. So in the beginning of the game, you can only donate 1 card, but once you upgrade, you could donate 2 and then 3. You're able to donate to any other player, so blue and yellow players could donate to each other. And you're also able to donate to the relief camp donations collection. And the reason that you're going to do that is if you pull a relief camp card out of the landowners deck, your number of donations to the relief camp are going to affect whether that's a relief camp that's controlled by the landowners or a relief camp that's controlled by you. And you definitely want it to be controlled by you. It's much nicer that way. There's also an optional venue for donations in the game, and those are the community goals. We haven't talked about them yet, but they've just been stacked over here. There's an optional module in the game that allows you to set community goals, and then you can donate specific cards towards those goals in order to reduce the losses on your loss track. So we're going to talk more specifically about the community goals later, but that's what they're for, and that's another reason donation might be really nice. The third type of action is work. And there are 3 things you can do with a work action. So you can accept work, and that basically means that you take job offer cards over here from the landowner card setup. You can seek work, and that means that you replenish landowner cards from the pile. Or you can do what's called working for the community, but that means that you take a community card. So if you are looking for a specific kind of card to help upgrade your powers, maybe you want a resistance action, you might want to dig in the community pile to get something that you're looking for. So to accept work, basically that means that you're taking these cards into your hand. So in this case, if I wanted to accept work, this is the only job offer card that's on offer right now. It's the only one I could take. I could take 1 card. If I wanted to spend my action seeking work first, then I could pull more cards off of the landowner deck and hope that some better cards come up so I can take more cards with that accept work action. So let's say that I want to replenish first. Let me seek work, and that would count as a work action. So now that I've done this one action, I can work again, but this time I can choose to accept work. And that would mean that I can take as many of these job offer cards as I want, and I can take them into my hand, and then I can either use them immediately, which we're about to talk about, or I can save them for later. And that means that I can save them to use with other job offer cards, or I can save them with the intention of building a raft during the upgrade player abilities phase of the next turn. Do note that there are bad things that come out of the landowner deck as well. And when that happens, you will be the active player because you were the one who sought work and drew those cards. And so things that happen to the active player are going to happen to you. And of course, some horrible group things can also come out of this lovely little landowners deck. But let's say that I want to work. If I took all 3 of these job offer cards, this would count as an accept work action. And I could, in fact, use some of these cards right away. So if you look at the bottom, this says during the player action phase, you can discard 2 of these to build a new levee, or you can discard 1 to raise an existing levee by 1. So if I wanted to, I could discard both of these cards to, let's say, build a new levee right here and just try to get these water levels up. And then maybe I want to hold on to this one in my hand for a future turn. So when you work, you can seek work, which is get cards out of the landowner deck. You can accept work, which means that you can take cards and you can build a levee right away, or you can hang on to the cards for later, or some combination of those things, which I just demonstrated. Or again, I could draw a community card if that was what I'd rather do. Then the final action option that I have is to resist. And resist basically means to play a card with the fist resist symbol on that card. There's several in the deck, but here are a couple of examples. Here we have the radio. I can either play this as a resist to counter a landowner card that comes up that has a negative effect, or I can discard it on my turn as an action to reveal the next 3 landowner cards. So you can use it as an action or as a symbol that helps to protect you and your team. So what this one lets you do if you play it as an action is to discard 1 of your cards to draw 2 community cards for yourself. Or if you discard 2 of your cards, then all the other players can also draw 2 community cards. So you're basically just enriching people's card options. So the resist cards are something that you want to hold in your hand in case you have to deal with a landowner, but they are pretty good if you use them as an action. After that, you are now in phase 4, reveal and resolve 3 weather report cards. So you would draw and resolve 3 weather reports, which again, we are not going to talk about just now. Skip to water rules if you want to know exactly how that's going to happen, because I want to make sure it's very clearly explained. But you're going to draw and resolve 3 weather report cards. Then you're going to clean up, and you are going to add a survivor pawn to Mound's Landing so they can really pile up over here. You're going to rotate the first player marker. So if blue went first this time, then yellow will go first next time. You're going to add 1 to the weak track. And you're going to draw your hand of community cards back up to 5. So if you have, for example, blue player only has 2 community cards hanging out right now, we would draw 3 more cards to bring our hand up to 5. And that is the structure of a turn in Rising Waters. Now it's time to talk about a few of the special aspects of this game, just to make sure they've all been explained. One of those is the relief camp. There are several relief camp cards in the 1927 setups landowner deck. So if you're playing with the 1926 game, you don't have relief camps. But here we do have relief camps, and they are landowner cards that are going to come up as you refill the landowner card pool and look for work. And whether the relief camp is a green relief camp that's in your control or a red one that's controlled by the landowners depends on the donations that you were making down here. So if you have enough donations for a relief camp, so that the number changes depending on how many players there are, then you would get to place a green relief camp anywhere you want on the entire map. And that's really convenient because these relief camps cannot be flooded, and this also just doesn't hurt you in any way. You're placing it somewhere that's convenient for you, and you've created a safe tile where you can drop off survivors or put pawns that are in a little bit of danger. On the other hand, if you don't have enough resources, a red relief camp is going to be built, and that is a very inconvenient thing. So, for example, all the cards are going to tell you where to put a red relief camp. We don't have any flooded hexes on this particular version of the map because I have not shown you the water rules yet, but we're just going to pretend that a water hex is flooded. So this one's going to say you're going to place a red relief camp next to the northernmost flooded hex in Yazoo Valley. You have to move 1 pawn per player there. You have to replace 1 survivor with a levee, and then you have to adjust the loss track. So instead of just placing a camp anywhere, and it's nice, we're instead going to have to look up here, and we're going to have to place this next to the northernmost flooded hex in the Yazoo Valley, which means it could also already be cut off from us a lot and not very convenient at all. So let's just go ahead and say that this is the northernmost flooded hex. We'll put the camp up there. So then, add insult to injury, not only is it like all the way up here, but you have to take a pawn from each player and put it there. So our pawns have been relocated. They're able to leave the camp, but this would interrupt anything that you're trying to do in the middle of play. And then even worse, you have to remove one of these pawns, replace it with a levee. So 5, we'll go from 4 to 5 over there. But that pawn has died. That is a loss. And so you have to track it up here on the losses counter. And if you want to know more about losses, I actually created a section in this video in the timestamps, so you can go check out everything that counts as a loss, but losing a survivor certainly does count. So these relief camps are very much a mixed blessing if they're not in your control. One thing that's good about them is that they cannot be flooded no matter where they are. So the good thing about a relief camp is it is a safe zone for anybody who ends up there, and you can continue to put survivors there. At the same time, it won't be conveniently located and it interrupts your people and it causes a loss. Whereas a green relief camp is all good and you have full control over it. The other thing to know about green relief camps, though, is that you are paying for them from your resources. So if I have 5 resources in a 2-player game and a relief camp card comes up, I have to spend those resources in order to place the camp. And then I have to save up again by donating cards in order to prepare for the next one. So you might end up with a situation where relief camps come out in close succession and you're able to build one of them for yourself, but then another one is going to be landowner controlled. So be aware that these relief camps are either a full blessing or a mixed blessing. It depends on how much effort you put into making sure they come out on the board. This is also going to lead to a discussion of how to get people to relief camps. And that means that we're going to talk about rescuing survivors. So we're going to do a quick raft recap, and we're going to talk about the rules of getting survivor pawns. And then we're going to talk about the rules of getting pawns to either towns or to the relief camps so that you can rescue them from up here in Mound's Landing, where things do look pretty darn dicey. So you'll have noticed at the beginning of each turn, you have a survivor pawn that pops up in Mound's Landing. We unfortunately just had to count one as a loss in our demo of getting a relief camp built. But how would we get this one over to this relief camp? Well, we're going to do that with a raft. I've mentioned before that rafts are a renewable player power. So if you have the ability to swim, you have a farm animal card, and you have one of these job offer cards in your hand because you took it when you accepted work on a previous turn, then you can spend those things to build a raft. So we had a demo where the blue pawn built a raft earlier, and it's currently on the water. Let's just say that the blue pawn was here and that the blue pawn built a raft, just for full demo. What will happen is that from this point forward, essentially this blue pawn has a raft with it at all times for the remainder of the game. You can drag the raft with you without actually having to lose any movement points. You can move the same amount. So there's no reason to ever get rid of a raft once you've built it. But basically what will happen is that the blue pawn is going to need to get to the survivor using move actions, and move doubles up on the water. So if blue has a base movement of 4, we could probably take a turn to go 1, 2, because you get to move double on the water, 3, 4, like so. And then we could take a second action, it does cost an action to do this, to put the survivor on the raft with us. Boom. So that survivor is currently on a raft, so we at least know they're not going to drown even if things get a little floody around here. Then on a future turn, we could essentially escort the survivor pawn to the camp. So if we were going to move over, it would probably take a couple of turns. So blue can go 1, 2, 3, 4. And then if we want to do another movement action, we could go 1, 2, 3, 4. And then, as a separate action, we would be able to drop off the pawn next turn at the relief camp. So note that you have to watch your movement, and also that it does cost an action to either pick up a survivor pawn or to drop them off. But that is how you use a raft to pick up and drop off survivor pawns so you can get them to your relief camp. It's like little escort missions that are added into the game. So that's how you do relief camps. That's also how you rescue survivor pawns. If you don't have a relief camp, you can still pull a survivor pawn over with you to a town or pull them onto a raft. So you can still rescue them. You just can't leave them in the convenient safe relief camp. Next, we're going to talk about a couple of the game's optional features. One of those is the community goals. And then we're also going to revisit individual player powers. So I'm going to go ahead and clear all of this out so we can look at those cards in detail. So first things first, let's have a quick look at community goals. These are an add-on to your game. They're not required to play with, but I actually do recommend them because they help you reduce losses on your loss track. And really, this is the primary way that that would be possible in a game of Rising Waters. So I'm all in favor of community goals. It also just gives you something extra to do with your donation action. So that's helpful as well. So the community goals have 2 designations. They're the A goals and they're the B goals. And if you look through all these cards, you're going to see they occur in pairs. So let me pair them up for you so you can see. So if we take a look at our A and B piles, you can see the art goes together really nicely, but there will be an A level community goal for build rescue equipment and also a B community goal for build rescue equipment. In order to fully move on and do this goal, which can take 2 off of your loss track and make the raft move faster, you have to complete the goal A before you can move on to B. So once we've completed build rescue equipment, the A version, when the B version comes up, then you are able to complete it. And that's also true for labor organizing, spreading African American music, increasing self-help efforts, increasing community communication. But they're not all going to come up in pairs. Instead, you shuffle the B cards and you put them on the bottom. You shuffle the A cards, you put them on top. And then you're going to draw 2 of these. And you're going to try to complete them. And then also each turn, during the cleanup phase, you can decide whether you want to keep these goals or whether you want to discard one and then draw another one. So you might want to do that because you have better cards to complete other goals, or you might want to do that because you've already completed one of them and you would like to bring more down to try to find that goal B. But basically, you set these up, and during cleanup, you can choose to discard one of them, but you also don't have to. You're allowed to leave the same goal there and just keep completing it. It's just that you might not want to do that because you probably want to fish for the upgraded version of goals that you're able to complete. To complete a goal, you do have to donate cards, and you're donating cards of a certain type. So for raised education levels, you're going to need to donate 3 education cards. If your goal is to write new blues songs, you need to donate 1 of the job offer cards and 2 of the blues cards. And then you're going to have to move 2 different pawns to their respective towns. So the requirement for the goal is always on the actual goal card. You keep track of donations underneath it, here with donations. And then if you complete it, you get the reward. So these are goals that you can cycle through mostly in the way that you want, because you can discard the ones that aren't working for you and you can leave the ones that are. The one thing that I would recommend, however, is that if you complete a goal and then discard it, you should put it to the side face up so that when you find the corresponding B goal, that you are able to know that you are eligible for it and you can get those extra rewards. The other thing I do want to flag once more is the option to play with individual victory points. These give you asymmetric startup powers. So you'd make sure to start with a cube on the red location on your player mat at setup, because everybody will start with asymmetrical powers if they play with this version of the game. And then you're also going to have a role and a way to get individual victory points. So rather than just read through every single one, I'm going to put the graphic from the rule book up here briefly. But as you can see, there are different things you're going to need to do. So for example, a teacher is going to get extra points for countering threat cards with education cards. Whereas a blues singer is going to have the goal to perform for as many others as they can, and they're going to get points whenever they're on the same hex as another pawn or a town of a different color and discard a blues card while they're there. So everybody's going to have just a little extra task to do to communicate that they have a slightly different role in the community, and they'll get points for fulfilling that role. However, you will absolutely still all be able to lose together, because Rising Waters is a game mostly about trying to preserve your community from flooding. So make sure that if you're playing with the individual points, you don't lose sight of the ultimate goal. And then last, I'm going to put just a little overlay from the PDF here from the rules, but I do want to go over what counts as a gameplay loss, because you're counting losses. You lose the game if you take enough of them, and we should have an explicit section to talk about what counts as a loss. So definitely things that count as losses. Land hex groups are lost when they are flooded, and all of the hexes are covered in blue flood hexes, which I am going to be showing you momentarily. And this counts as a loss whether it's complete or partial. So even if you have a levee that is very high, if the rest of the land hex group gets flooded, then it's still a loss. But the good news is that only the hex group counts as a loss and not each individual hex. So at least there's that. Towns are lost when the hex where a town is located floods, and you have to remove those from the board. So you want to make sure that you are protecting your towns. Levees are lost when they are flooded or when you draw a dynamite card from the landowners deck. You have to remove those from the board and you have to take a loss. Pawns are lost if they are on the land hex that gets flooded. So if a pawn is lost, then the player has to reduce their pawn number by 1 on their player board. Lost pawns get removed from the board. And you can pay to get your pawns back through your player board abilities, but if you lose survivors, they are just lost. The landowners deck also contains landowner fleas cards that automatically cause losses when landowners just get out of dodge and abandon you. So there are automatic losses that can happen from the landowner's deck. And you can also get penalty losses if you're unable to pay penalties. So for example, if a race hatred or force card comes up and y'all cannot actually fulfill the penalty of the card, then you will also take losses. So make sure that you are keeping some cards in hand to discard, for example, if it comes up that it's necessary, because you do not want to take losses because you didn't keep enough cards in your hand. And then once again, just so you can see, here are the rules for the end of the game. You have to survive 7 rounds in the fall of 1926 or 10 in the spring of 1927, and you are only allowed. So the losses shown on this graphic are the ones that you are allowed to have based on the scenario that you're playing and the number of players in your game. If you go over that, it is game over. If you stay at or under that level, then you win. All right, so now we are all zoomed in, and we're going to be focused on water rules. So this is a game about flooding. We've made it through basically everything else in the game but the flooding part. Now I'm going to show you how to do it. So at setup and at the end of every single round of this game, you're going to draw and resolve 3 weather report cards. And those can look a number of different ways. You can have sunny cards, which are rare but delightful when they show up, that lower the water level. Clouds that leave everything the same. Light rain that adds 1 to the water level in your area. Medium rain that adds 2 to the water level in your area. Or the most dreaded heavy rain that adds 3 to water in your area. So we're going to talk about how you add water as we go. And I'm just going to use our beloved Tinsaw Basin as our example. So we do have to go through a couple of notes first. One is that this is the fall 1926 map. And as you can see, the water level starts at 1. We are not actually going to stick with that. We're going to switch to 1927, where the water level is going to start at 2. So we're going to assume that all of this water is level 2 all the way down, but you do get a little bit of a decrease if you're playing 1926 version of this game. Some other tips to always follow are to remember that water is always going to flow downhill or downstream. So we're going to be going from north to south. And the last thing, the most important thing, which is what we're about to walk through, is the steps of the water level rules. So what you should always do is place water level tokens first, then resolve them. So you want to draw all of your weather report cards. You want to place tokens out for all 3 of those cards, and then you want to resolve all 3 of those cards after you've already placed everything out on the board. So I'm going to show you exactly how that's going to work. And we are going to do it here in Tensaw Basin because I want to show you how water is going to flow downstream when rain hits the same spot again and again as well. So let's say that we're drawing our weather report cards, and our first one is light rain in the Tensaw Basin. That's not so bad. It's got 1 droplet on it. This is level 2 water because it's always going to be level 2 for starters on the year 1927 side. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a water token, and the token is going to go here to tell us what the new water level is. So since it started out as a 2 and we're adding 1 level, then we're going to put a 3 here. Very simple, right? Right. And then we're going to draw another weather report. Okay, so we got another light rain in the Tensaw Basin. So now what do? What we're going to do is see how you have these water hex groups here on the river. So what you're going to do is you're going to put your water level token in the next hex group down from the last one where you placed it. So once again, we had a base water level of 2. We've added 1 droplet of water. So we're going to put a 3 here. Nice. So we're going to keep moving down the river. And basically, if you end up with a situation where everything's already been flooded previously on previous turns, then you come back up to the top. But until that happens, you keep going downstream. So now we're going to draw another weather report card. Oh no, heavy rain in the Tensaw Basin. So we're not going to put the token here. We're not going to put the token here. We're going to put it right here. And this time we're going to add 3 water because it's heavy rain. So 2 plus 3 is 5. Boom. Now there is a 5 water level token here to indicate all of the water levels. So I've drawn 3 cards. We're done for now. We don't have to do any more. You only ever draw 3 cards at a time. Now we're going to resolve what we have. So I've placed all the water tokens out. Then you resolve all of the water tokens. So what's going to happen here is we're going to begin in the north, and then we're going to go downstream, moving south. So we're moving with the river here. So we are first going to resolve this Tensaw Basin token. And the first thing that we're going to do is look at the surrounding land. The way that the water flooding will work, by the way, is that as in real life, this game aspires for ecological accuracy. You're going to flood the surrounding land, and then you're going to flood water by going further downstream. So these tokens are not only going to flood land, they're also going to impact water levels going downwards. So here, what we're going to do is first we're going to see if there's any land that is at a lower level than 3. And actually, as you can unfortunately see, that is very much the case. We have a 2 here, a 2 here, and a 2 here. So which part do we flood? We're going to follow what's called the clockwise rule in this game. So like it's a clock, we're going to start up here at 12 noon, and we're going to come around. So this 3 matches the water level. This is not going to flood. This 2, however, it's lower than the water level. This is going to flood. So what will happen is we are going to put hexes here to indicate that a flood has occurred in this hex group. So you flood the entire hex grouping. It's not 1 hex at a time. Water floods the entire group. And then I would also take a loss for this group up here on the last tracker because we've lost some land. However, I am also going to adjust the water level, which is now down to 2. So the 2 is actually good though, because what we're going to do is we're going to look around again. And fortunately, there is no land that is at a lower elevation than 2. So we don't have to resolve any more of this token. We're just going to leave it at 2. If it was still too high, it would flow downstream and actually raise this level a bit, and then we'd resolve that token. But we don't have to, so we're okay for now in this part of the Tensaw Basin. Now, we're going to resolve the next token down. And we're going to look at this 3, and we're going to go from land to water. So first, we're going to look at the land. So this is fine. This is a 3. This is a 3. Uh-oh. This hex grouping is a 2. That's rough because we're going to have to flood out this entire hex grouping. So we're going to flood the group, and then we're going to lower the token to 2. So the good news is that this is now down to 2. So we've done pretty good. We don't have to flood anything else. We don't have to go downstream. However, we did already take 2 losses here. So we took losses for our lost hex groups that have now been flooded with water. If there had been a town or pond in these flooded areas, those would also have been lost, and we would have brought up our losses tracker. So as you can see, it's pretty tough to prevent the losses from racking up in this game, which is why you want to make sure that you're working really hard together to do things like community goals to reduce them. You want to build levees along the water to try to stop this from happening, which we're going to talk about just a little bit more in a moment. But for now, this is resolved, and so we're going to move to the next token down, this 5. So we got a lot to do with this token here. So first we're going to land, and then we're going to go to water. So the way this is going to work is we are going to follow the clockwise method because this 5 is higher than basically everything. We have a 3, a 4, a 2, and a 3. But what we're going to do is we're going to go clockwise to this lowest land value, to the 2. And that's going to be another loss, but this 5 will become a 4. However, that 4 is actually not sufficient. We do need to keep going. So we flooded land. We're not going to flood land immediately a second time. What we're going to do instead is flood downstream. So we're going to push the water downstream because that's how that happens in nature as well. So instead of doing the clockwise thing and coming to the 3, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're instead going to change this 4 to a 3. And we're going to push one value of that flooding further downstream, so that we also have a 3 here. And good news, however, if you look around, this is at the value of the lowest land around it, so we're not going to have any more flooding this turn. That would have fully resolved all of the water tokens for now. So let's hope we don't get any more rain in the Tensas Basin. So as you can see, after resolving all of that, we have leveled the water back out, but we've lost 3 different hex groupings. And that was a pretty big loss for just one turn. But that's okay. We're going to keep figuring it out. So if more water did come to the Tensas Basin, you would keep placing the tokens lower down the river. Once there was a token on all of these, then you would start back up at the top and you would add another flood token to indicate that this had been flooded before. But essentially, you're always going to go downriver and then head back up to the top once you have flooded all parts of this river. That's also going to apply to areas like Cabin Teal. So you're never going to keep going downriver with Cabin Teal rain into the Tensas Basin. Instead, when rain falls in Cabin Teal, you're going to flood down the river. And then once there have been tokens placed all the way down, then you go back up for the next Cabin Teal weather card. Another potentially special thing to consider is lakes. So when you're doing the Yazoo Valley, basically you're dropping tokens from hex group to hex group up here in the lake. So you start up here with Yazoo Valley, and then you go down hex group by hex group from north to south. The other thing to talk about is when you're resolving weather cards, because remember you put all the tokens out before you do any resolution. When you've put everything out and it's time to resolve, you start with the Yazoo Valley, then you go up to Mound's Landing, and you come down the river bit by bit until all the resolutions are done. So always do things from north to south. That's always the right procedure in this game. You can't go wrong. All right, so I want to talk about how levees work in terms of water rules, just because I think this is important and it can be a little bit tougher. So in the 1926 version of the game, when you place a levee, it makes the entire hex group the level of the levee. So like you get to multiple hexes for one levee. In 1927, unfortunately, that is not the case, and it only is per hex in a specific hex group. So let's re-resolve this with levees in place just so you can see how that would work. So let's say that we've got this 3 in the Tensas Basin. When we're looking for places to flood, we are going to ignore this 3 because even though this hex is a 2, the 3 is right up on the river. So it's not going to go over the levee and then into this hex. It's just going to hang out. So this hex group got saved. However, we're going to go around clockwise and oh no, the next thing that this is touching is this hex group. So this 3 levee only protects this hex. The rest of this is a level 2. So what's going to happen is we're going to flood these 3 areas, so the remainder of this hex group, with water, even though this specific space remains safe. If we later have an overflow that affects this space, we'll lose the levee too, and that will count as another loss. But unfortunately, the entire hex group does not have to be covered with water for it to be counted as a loss. Even though one hex in this hex group is saved by the levee for now, that still counts as a loss on your loss tracker, which is pretty brutal. Then we're going to come down to this 3. We're going to want to make it a 2, but we can't do it just yet. So now we have another problem. And the problem is that this water is now connected to this hex group, rut row. So now we're going to look to resolve this 3. And before, it might have flooded this hex group. But because this hex group is now part of the water, we're going to go around. So this is 3, 3. We're fine. 3 and 3. This won't flood. This is fine. But, uh-oh, here we are with this 2 that is now in contact with the water. So this 3 will flood here. And we have another loss. So this has been some nasty rain in Tensas Basin. And so now when we're resolving for this hex group, the water that it's touching changes because there's more water touching more stuff. Then we are going to go down river. And this is going to work out exactly the same. So we'll go down to 4. This will flood. And then when you flood land, you flood water next, always. So this is actually going to turn into a 3. And the water will come down here for another 3. And this should have been turned into a 2 earlier when I reduced it. So that is a couple of examples of how water is going to resolve based on how your levees are placed. And I hope that this helps you kind of see just how crazy this flooding can get. This is still 3 losses. And so you want to be placing your levees as strategically as possible to protect everything that you possibly can and to make sure that you aren't accidentally pushing water into places you don't want it to go. So that is the absolute basics of the water rules for rising waters. Hopefully this was helpful, and there are additional illustrations in the rulebook to make sure that you catch everything for you to check out. So this is the conclusion of our digital rulebook for rising waters. Please feel free to use the timestamps to skip around as you need, and hopefully this answers your basic questions. Thank you so much for watching, and happy gaming, everyone.